Welcome back to the Horizons Review. I'm here with Cody again, and today we're going to talk about Kant's ethics. This is a topic that Cody wanted to bring up for a number of reasons. Definitely a topic I'm no expert in, but yeah, Cody, why did you want to discuss Kant's ethics today?
Yeah, I got on a Immanuel Kant kick maybe in like the last year of my PhD, and prior to that, as I'd been informed about philosophy and Kant's philosophy, I'd always had this image of him as this really heavy-handed like thinker. You would often be talking to people who were like, "Well, Kant's ethical system or like his view of how humans relate to the world works like this, and it's clearly dumb." And for me, whenever someone says that someone who I presume is really smart has said something really dumb, that it's like an anti-vaccine for me. It kind of leads me towards that person, and I kind of want to see what they said. And so what I realized is that people had been given this very cartoon caricature version of Kant compared to what I had actually been reading um, in his work, uh, particularly with regards to his deontological ethics, which we'll get into what that means here in a bit. And the idea that he said, if you have a murderer at your front doorstep who's here to kill your friend, and the murderer asks you, uh, "Is your friend here?" Uh, People like to say all the time, "Well, Kant said yes. You ethically you have to tell the murderer that your friend is there."
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. The example
I
people
went
always
back.
like to do now is like they like to go whole hog and like do the SS officer is coming for the Jew in your attic. Yeah,
Yeah, they insert this like Anne Frank scenario into this conversation at the time. But if you actually go back and you read what was being critiqued there in this dialogue between Kant and his interlocutor, what you end up finding is that actually he had a totally nuanced view, and in the context of this thought experiment, he kind of he created an argument where he said yes to the answer, but he said it in such a way that I think shines light on how smart that guy really was.
yeah.
So,
The thing I wanted to say about this is like there's two things. It's like one, it's that rereading the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals and the metaphysics of morals is that Kant really thinks that what he's trying to do is provide a basis for the everyday our everyday conscience. Like he's like, we already know what the moral law is, and he thinks this project is going to protect it from the perversions of moral theory.
mhm.
And then the other thing that I think about like the way that we misunderstand Kant probably comes from like what type of work the groundwork is and what type of work the metaphysics of morals is and like how they get taught specifically in Anglo-American universities. Because I actually went and like surveyed a number of people I know who've majored in philosophy, and a very common thing was the experience that I had as an undergraduate with Kant was the only work of Kant's that I ever read in its entirety was the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals in an ethics class. Like there were selections that were read in like a modern philosophy survey and a few other things. And there's a couple interesting things about that. Is one, it's that the groundwork is not the same sort of work of ethics that a lot of the other works of ethics that you read in those sorts of classes are. And my professor for ethics was great. I mean, fantastic professor, really smart guy, came out of a very good analytic PhD program, like had all the credentials. But like at no point did he say, give a description of like why this book was significantly different than some of the other books we were reading in the class. Um, which is it really is providing the system of metaphysical absolutes behind which you could even develop a sense of duties in the first place.
Right.
Like
Right.
there's maybe like three layers to ethics. There's like the extreme meta ethical layer, then there's a layer of duties, then there's a layer of actions on top of
Yeah.
duties that you could say is happening. And most works of ethics that you read are primarily, especially in the Anglo American tradition, are primarily works about actions. They might be works about duties as well. They're very rarely strictly meta ethical works in the analytic tradition. Um, so that makes it very, because the most extreme statements are all in the groundwork. They're not actually in the metaphysics of morals, which is much more subtle and willing to take into account um, anth- anthropology and not just sort of the true idealism of the groundwork. Um, and that's sort of like, so this is just my like backseat theory about why we might be here, because I had similar wonders about this, but sort of from another end. Was not people giving facile critiques of Kant, but people using him in what I felt was sometimes a very facile sense when I was a law student.
Hmm.
Um, there's a lot of what people say is a Kantian influence on especially contract law and criminal law. Um, but it all seemed to come from this place of like reading the very extreme uh, idea of the categorical imperative that's in the groundwork,
Hmm.
and not much to do with either Kant's doctrine of right or doctrine of virtue from the metaphysics of morals. Um, and for those who aren't familiar, so the categorical imperative, which you've probably heard of, is basically it's like you need to, every action that you do, like you have to act as if will as if that were a universal law. Like that is how it is formulated, and the it's very easy to create cartoon versions of the categorical
Yeah.
imperative if you treat it as a law about everyday action and not as a law about how you derive systems of duties.
Yeah. Like how should we arrange a society? Well, it seems that to have everything working in the right order, you have to make sure that everyone is effectively behaving the same way with these principles. Otherwise, you can't have this system to begin with, right?
Yeah. It was really interesting for me revisiting these works because I hadn't read either of them. I hadn't read the groundwork um, since I was an undergraduate. So that was 20 years ago at this point. And I hadn't read the Metaphysics of Morals for about like 12 or 13 years.
Mm.
And I'm not very well versed in Kant in general. Like, I read quite a bit of him in high school when I was sort of like reading through the history of Western philosophy as a teenager. Uh, and like, he was never someone who grabbed me in the way that some other thinkers have, or even thinkers of his own era. Like, I've
Yeah.
revisited more minor people like Schelling much more often than I've revisited Kant. But now I kind of regret it. It's like, actually, yeah, I probably need to go back and make some serious study of these books again at some point. So that was a good externality of preparing for this particular episode.
It's good to note that Khan, I don't want to summarize him too much, but to think about him as having kind of two major projects. The first one being his critical philosophy, which is, he he encounters Hume in Hume's radical skepticism, and he says it awakened him from his dogmatic slumber, right? And in the idea of his whole critical philosophy is the idea of the human agent or the human mind, more or less is constructing the world, thinking of the brain the mind as building an interpretation of the world around it, rather than being, like a satellite receiver of just information that's out there, right? He has this whole concept of the noumena, which is what there really is, and the phenomena, which is what we experience. And to really say anything about the world is to say it on the level of phenomena. And that comes from his critique of pure reason. But I personally, I really liked his critique of judgment, which was the last one that he wrote. Because in that one, he's doing all kinds of he's like playing with Aristotle. He's talking about, what is teleology, how is it that teleology emerges, and how does it mix with our understanding of the world, and then how does teleology relate to aesthetics? Like why do humans make art and so on? And he talks about art as having kind of the highest purpose because it's something that you don't really find in nature. It's like purely symbolic. They're just kind of ideas that are fun to toy with, and so
Yeah. Yeah, the
my
idea of, yeah, like it is interesting that Kant has this hidden influence in the way that critics have talked about art ever since.
Mhm.
The idea of art is something that exists for its own sake. The idea of like pure and impure arts, like you can trace all of these more to his aesthetic theory than any other. Yeah, like any any time that, yeah, someone critiques like a particular, like when we have these debates about like, oh, is like, are video games art or something like this, like you hear these echoes of Kantian arguments when people have that
Yeah,
discussion,
yeah.
and they
Right.
don't even, yeah, don't even know it.
And well, I read all that and I loved it, but I kind of I totally ignored his all of his writing on ethics actually, because every time someone talked about it to me, it just sounded super cringe. It sounded it sounded uh, like your modern game theorist or something, trying to map out the possible space of all moral principles, similar to like Isaac Newton or something in the Newtonian age, saying, well, deduce. Now I can deduce all kinds of things about natural systems using mathematics. And when I heard that Kant had kind of a similar project for ethics, it just totally turned me off. Um, until the contrarianism uh, came in, and I was trying to think of an alternative to virtue ethics, and a friend pointed me in this direction and said, actually, maybe you would like to lean into the cringe. And it turns out I did like his deontology quite a bit.
Yeah, I do think it is somewhat hard to sympathize with the degree to which Kant though does believe in the sufficiency of reason, I think, in a way that people rarely do anymore. I think people like there's much more painful awareness of I think the contingent aspect of human reasoning today. So when you come across someone who has like this still like very enlightenment faith in absolute reason, like you do, yeah, you do want to associate them with people who do seem uh, very hard to sympathize with today. But I don't feel that way reading Kant. Like I feel more like he's a
Mhm.
product of his time. Like there's a particular project that made sense at a particular time, and he took that project as far as it could possibly go, really.
Yeah,
And the people who try to work in that project since, um, yeah, yeah, I mean, how much is all of continental philosophy footnotes to
yeah.
Kant from that point forward? Like his influence is just overwhelming in a way that's probably hard for us to appreciate in the English speaking world.
It is funny though, because we're going to talk about virtue ethics in a moment. And I oftentimes associate virtue ethics with Catholicism.
Yeah.
Just the vast number of virtue ethicists who tend to be Catholics. But at the same time, two people who were like massive Kant boos uh, were like two of the previous popes, John Paul II. Um, really thought that he could make something out of Kantian ethics in person and act, but also Benedict XVI. Um, but of course, perhaps in Benedict's case, it's because he was German. But you know, I mean,
Well, I
it may
mean,
be, yeah.
yeah. I mean, how much is that though our own anglophone parochialism?
Hmm.
Like the revival of virtue ethics is very, very predominant in anglophone philosophy.
Yeah, that's right.
It's less of a feature of philosophy outside the English speaking world. And it's not that like people don't recognize this or like recognize these philosophers, like figures that are like, if you're in France because they teach philosophy in French lycées, like there's basically a state approved list of like who the major philosophers are. And at some point pretty recently, like they added Elizabeth Anscombe and Iris
Oh
Murdoch,
wow.
who are both major figures for the revival of virtue ethics in the English speaking world. Um, but like once again, it does feel like that particular project has been largely an English speaking world project. And like you
Hmm.
say, like it's been over it feels overwhelmingly Catholic. Anscombe was Catholic. Uh McIntyre becomes a Catholic. Um, so a number of these figures that we like are religious in some sense, or they are specifically Catholic. Um, and this makes some sense because it's easier to it's somewhat more comfortable to define Aquinas as a virtue ethicist than some other
Hmm.
things, but when you actually read his more specifically ethical works, they actually don't seem that Aristotelian. Like they're more derived from first principles in this more
Hmm.
like rationalistic top down way. So I actually, yeah, that would be another interesting episode maybe in the future to talk about is like actually is Aquinas a virtue ethicist in the way that we mean that in the 21st century?
One the other group that I've often found to be virtue ethicists, and this is where I think uh, Kant's kind of ideas really help out a lot, are libertarians. Um,
Yeah,
because like you don't want to like give people rules, you know. Uh, I guess is like the idea behind a lot of libertarians, and so if you just like nudge them in the right ways with like the right cultural, uh, ethical context, they'll just end up being better out of aesthetic appreciation for virtue.
yeah, but that's like
Um,
once again, I mean, that's a specifically like Anglo type of libertarian. And then if you look at even the English speaking libertarians who come out of like Mises in the Austrian school, like they often do argue in this much more Kantian fashion, like the
yeah,
non-aggression principle and things like
well,
this of like
that's what I
more,
was gonna
yeah,
say. Yeah,
yeah, more like absolute duties and laws, and then deriving libertarianism from these
yeah.
absolute duties and laws.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to say. I was going to say, but you could, there's another branch in libertarianism
Yeah,
which includes the NAP, and
yeah,
the NAP, the non-aggression principle. It's like if you squint, like you're looking at what is effectively like the categorical imperative, right? It's like conduct your
yeah.
business such that you don't harm other people,
Yeah,
right?
is notorious YouTuber Stefan Molyneux like actually the most
Oh,
famous English Kantian?
literally not an argument.
Yeah,
So do you want to talk about the murder example and like
Yeah,
why?
yeah. Go ahead and go through what you have to say about this.
Okay. So for Kant, in his deontological worldview, um, with his like giga nap, basically with the categorical imperative, like is you should follow your rules as if they are universal. So like the reason to not steal is because stealing is just bad universally. The reason to not lie is because lying is bad universally. If you compare it with like a utilitarian calculation, it's not that, well, if I lie, it will create this much badness and this much goodness in the world. Therefore, under this instance, I should lie. Um, no, it's instead like you ought to be saying that this is right and this is wrong. Because again, if you have people just walking around applying their own standards, even if everyone is being prudential, you're going to have all kinds of disagreements. And so, the way in which you should structure a moral system or a philosophy is one in which you have duty, and those are things that you owe to others, or things that you owe to the world, things that your moral system tells you is right. You should always do under all circumstances. And this got Kant into some hot water. During his time, another philosopher, Benjamin Constant, came up with the thought experiment of the murderer, where he says, "Look, imagine you have a murderer who can uh, compel you to speak, um, who is looking for your friend, um, and you have a duty basically to respond to them." So it's a thought experiment because in the Kantian system, this kind of person can't exist. But he says, so if that's the case, if this hypothetical murder exists and they want to kill your friend, and your friend shows up to your front door and hides in your attic, and the murderer follows him. When you open the front door, if the murderer asks you, "Is your friend in the house?" you have to say yes. And Constance says, "This is silly. Like, why would anyone believe this? Like, gee, I would love to hear Kant's perspective on this." And Kant responds in like a letter. I forget what the letter's called. It's like on a supposed it's like essay on a supposed right to lie. He like he calls it a supposed right, saying, "Yeah, I disagree with this in principle," and he says, "Correct, I am saying that," which is kind of awesome. But people take it the wrong way because they don't. First of all, they don't read what Constant actually said, and then they don't read what Kant actually said. So Kant says, in this scenario where you have a murderer, um, who basically uh, can compel you to reveal private information and who you have a duty to respond to, you may lie to them. But the thing is that this murderer in real life actually can't exist. So part of the reasons why Kant still ends up being correct in this, despite this nightmare scenario of you having to respond to some demon, within the Kantian moral system, he meant a very like specific thing when he said lie. It's not just like mere falsification, but it's like a purposeful falsification when it comes to duty. So like if you give someone the wrong information, right? Um, but you didn't know it, that's not lying. But if you lied to the murderer, knowing that you're lying, right, that's lying. But the thing is that you do not have technically a duty to murderers, or to those who infringe on others' rights. So, in response to the idea that instead of it being a murderer, it's like the SS looking for Jewish people, uh, you don't have to respond to the SS. You don't have a duty. They violated the Giganap. No, they violated the whole moral truth in such a way that you don't have a duty to them. The other thing is that if you're forcefully compelled, as you would be by a murderer, you actually don't have a duty to anyone, because again, they've already come against your rights. And then finally, uh, kind of at the basis of Kant's moral philosophy to begin with is that you actually don't have a duty to reveal private information to anyone in any scenario. Uh, because this is just a violation of the human being, of the self. So, hypothetically, one thing you could do is you could just not respond to the murderer, or you could close the door, right? Um, and so the question emerges is like, why would Kant agree to this? Like, why would he even agree to this thought experiment? And he thought it'd be illustrative of how his moral system actually works. So, in this experiment, um, with this hypothetical murderer, uh, you could compare it to a situation in which someone shows up to your house and they ask for directions somewhere, and you send them to the wrong side of town. And the person goes to the wrong side of town and they're murdered. Um, in the eyes of the law, should you be liable or partially liable to that murder? Kant is saying yes, because what you did when you lied, knowingly lied, is you altered basically the reality of that other person's world such that they died. Um, so, in the case where what you're doing is you're lying to the murderer, right? And your friend escapes, um, or sorry, the murderer kills your friend, uh, you would not be liable in that system if the murderer walks past you and kills your friend. If you lied to the murderer and your friend goes out the window, and then your friend is killed by the murderer later that day, because the murderer left and just so happened to run into your friend, you would then be legally liable. So, in the case where you lied to the murderer, you haven't wronged your friend, you haven't wronged the murderer, but you have wronged effectively the state of the world that everyone's in, right? And so he's saying, in the situation in which you gave up your friend, um, you didn't mess with the boundary conditions of the world in the same way that you did if you did lie and your friend was killed. Which I find very interesting, right? It says something about public duty and, when you actually violate moral principles, who's the agent that's harmed? And in a sense, Kant says, in some way, it's the world. Um, it's not merely the person that you lied to, but you've done a universal wrong, and therefore you've harmed the entire moral truth. Uh, Kyle, you're muted.
Sorry, yeah. He also though says it's to the self and
Hmm.
and not just the
Yeah.
world, which is interesting because there seems to be another person required in his system for lying. And so instead he says that it's the internal judge that you have, which operates as
Hmm.
if it were another person in this case. But yeah, it's not exactly clear to me how much we can escape Kant from this critique when we consider the doctrine of virtue question on lying. Because, so, yeah, according to his doctrine of right, things are
Yeah.
only lies insofar as they violate a duty. Um, but in the case of the doctrine of virtue, he says, well, no intentional untruth can refuse that this harsh name that's lying, and this would include lies that we tell ourselves. Like on a philological aside, it's interesting to me that the word that he uses for honesty, just in terms of like declarations that you make to other people, like then he's just calling it Ehrlichkeit. And this is something we've lost this cognate in English, though we had it in Old English, which is Ehrlich. And it like had like it's this old Proto-Germanic root, and it has like this sense of like both honesty, but also like honor and nobility. And those ideas like honor and nobility, they don't have a huge role in
You could say
Kantian
that's weird that
moral.
he uses that word
Yeah.
then. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's not. No, I think he's actually doing it because he's assigning a lower value to that
Hmm.
kind of honesty, to the honesty
Oh, right,
of mere
right.
declarations, than he is to other sorts of truthfulness, like like promises or honesty in
Mm-hmm.
general, which like he uses a word that means candor. So like those seem to be higher values than like the mere declarations that you would make, for
Yeah.
example, to the murderer. Um, and so anyway, so Kant then in the Doctrine of Virtue, he uses this example of the servant who's been instructed by his master to say that he's not home if a certain person comes calling. And like this seems like a pretty normal white lie to most people. Like when I was a kid, my grandmother used to go out and have me ring the doorbell when a certain like loquacious person was on the phone, so she had an excuse to get off of it. Uh, but like Kant says, well, what if the master uses like his servant lying about
Yeah.
his presence in the home to like slip away and commit a serious crime? Well, then the servant is also morally to blame for the master's crime. Uh, but then he says it's interesting. It's like he doesn't then say it's because he violated like some duty to the world. It's like he actually violated. He's guilty because he violated the duty to himself
Mm-hmm.
by engaging in the falsehood. Um, so it does seem difficult how you come up with a version of how society functions in the presence of bad actors, um, when we assign such a high value to the fact that lies have a degrading
Mm-hmm.
effect on the person who says the lie. Because I thought here there's a stoic distinction between lies and falsehoods.
Yeah.
So for something to be a lie, there has to be some sort of like malice or avarice or cowardice involved in like the motivation for it. But a falsehood could be either sort of trivial or it could even be made to uphold some other virtue. Um, and this seems like consequentialism, but I do think it does differ from mere consequentialism. But the problem is like I do think Kant is saying something real, which is that violating honesty intentionally does something damaging to you as a person, and that this probably adds up. Like if you're continually having to engage in
Yeah.
these white lies in order to make your way through the world, um, there's some there's some serious issue, and these can even be lies of omission. Um, so like I put the piece on the Substack recently about dissembling about politics. And like I really think about it, it's like, yeah, it's like it's a lie of omission for me that's like motivated in cowardice to dissemble about like where I stand politically excessively. Like this doesn't mean like with people that like I interact with like very temporarily. Like if someone starts ranting to me at my local McDonald's about politics, like I'm under no duty to like say I disagree with you. But when it happens in the context of friends that you see all the time, like this like continual like dissembling about where you stand like adds up, even though like you could say like this is a mere falsehood, like they have no right to your internal point of view. Like there's all these things that you can say that give you no particular moral duty uh, to have candor in these
Mm-hmm.
situations. And also there's like a question of risks, and those risks are very different depending on the sort of person that you are.
Yeah.
Um, so like something that I brought up in the Substack piece is like, oh well, like your risks probably like in being and having candor about politics are much greater if you're a woman than if you're a man. Um, not just because of like pure physical violence, so that's
Greater.
like yeah, like but that's like a real thing to consider. But also I think like your social risks are much
Yeah.
higher, um, given the way that sociality functions for women, not just within women, but also like women vis-a-vis men. Like I think that
Yeah.
I think that internet like pop internet misogyny like often assigns like a bunch of things to interactions between women that also are kind of true of how men treat women. Like
Yeah.
it's not just about intra female relations at all. But that's another story. So yeah, like I appreciate this aspect in Kantian ethics of, okay, well, there's the lie itself, and this also comes out in other aspects of the doctrine of virtue. Um, like he's very concerned with the effects of various deficits of virtue on the self. So when he talks about
Yeah.
avarice, he's like, oh yeah, there's avarice towards the outside, which could violate some duty to society or something like this. But really, like the sort of avarice that is really more damaging is actually the sort of avarice where you're so stingy that you don't give yourself the goods that enable a good life.
Hmm.
Like he actually envisions it's actually like who it's actually Ebenezer Scrooge is the ultimate avaricious person because Scrooge, like, despite some adaptations of A Christmas Carol, like isn't a person who's like this like evil marauding capitalist who's like out there like just like beating the poor and shaking them out for the money. Like he's ultimately like just a miser. Like he won't light a fire to keep himself warm. Like he's so
Yeah.
protective of his wealth, he just creates misery for himself. And that's like the Kantian definition of avarice is Ebenezer Scrooge.
I love
Um,
it. Yeah. I love it because it gives you effectively like a third way, right? Sometimes I'll be thinking about Kant and how do I know the situation in which I'm like going to falsify information to someone isn't going to become like a lie in which someone gets murdered and I've
yeah,
destroyed the public duty versus, there's points where he says, I think one of his examples is like, imagine a student worked really hard on a paper and they like want you to read it and it's trash. He's like, you're like allowed to tell this student it was okay.
yeah.
You know,
But he
he,
also brings up in the Doctrine of Virtue, like signing off your letters, like your obedient servant. Like everyone
yeah.
knows that it's a lie, but he it kind of does come off as he's saying like that's like an actual lie. And then there's an entire section later on called on servility. It's like, yeah, like excessive servileness towards others is actually like you demeaning yourself as a human being.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, just think about how rich this is. But when you're trying to make like a third way, on right or wrong, and uh, is it the case that I'm going to be utilitarian and I'm only going to use, some doctrine of prudence, like is this right based on my calculation right now? Or I'm a virtue ethicist and I'm like, does this yeah, I have to be honest, I'm highly ignorant of virtue ethics, but it's like, is this what a virtuous person ought to do? I feel like Kant almost gives you this. If you take an interpretation of him that isn't like full blown uh, absolutist, deontological, gives you a way of like being a virtue ethicist without making it by aligning the goodness of your actions to some principle rather than to broader virtue on oneself.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is like I think reading Kant this way like does expose a real problem for the Anglo-American revival of virtue ethics because he usually does just sort of have this general view of like human flourishing. And while you can talk very convincingly about like a lot of the things that make for a flourishing human life, like you do ultimately have to make some sort of like grounded reason like why these are flourishing. It isn't dissimilar from the problem that you can't derive what is the good that you're maximizing for in consequentialist ethics via consequentialism itself. So, like, what are the metaphysical origins of the particular principles by which we can judge what is virtuous action at all. So, I mean, Aristotle does try to do this. Like, it isn't in the Nicomachean Ethics specifically, but like Aristotle does try to do this. But
Mm.
disturbingly, this lack of trying to talk about the metaphysical origins of the principles which like create virtuous action, even specifically religious virtue ethicists, like often I feel like paper this over. Um, and it sometimes makes me wonder, are there defects in prior Christian discussions of ethics which are being exposed? I'm not sure about that. I think like it's worth talking at some point about
Mm.
early patristic ethics. Um, and I think of ethics as being a toolbox when it comes to action. And I have an essay, I'm sort of like a fifth of the way through it, that I've been working on for the Substack about like how I feel like
Mm.
consequentialism, utilitarian theories fit into an ethical toolbox. But even making sense of that toolbox view of ethics, like you have to have some grounding for ethics and something real and permanent.
Right. You had to be able to say,
So,
like, what's the point of
yeah,
following all these rules?
yeah. So, like, of the modern virtue ethicists, like, I do think Iris Murdoch made a serious attempt to ground what the idea of virtue is in the sovereignty of the good. But a lot of virtue ethicists have failed to do this. And, like, I don't want to get gossipy, but like when you look at the lives of some of these people who are like reviving virtue ethics, like virtue does sometimes seem to be a cover for the idea of self-realization, maybe more in like the psychological
Mm.
or Jungian sense, and thus you're like just using it to
Yeah,
justify your
yeah.
sexual escapades or so on.
Yeah,
But
sure.
yeah, but like metaphysically grounded conceptions of virtues, though, often lead to conclusions that might seem shocking, kind of like Kantian ethics can seem shocking. So I was thinking about when I was reviewing my notes for this today, came to mind is that St. Ambrose has this writing on repentance. And in that, like, so important to give some context here. Ambrose is probably one of the most detailed ethical thinkers of the early Christian philosophers. Like Augustine also has very detailed ethics, but Ambrose is maybe even more detailed about ethics. And it does have like this very obvious both Stoic and Aristotelian grounding in how he talks about it. So, anyways, he says, well, the highest aim of virtue is to wish for the good of all, which, you know, that
Mm.
almost sounds
Yeah.
consequentialist. But then he says, and if that's true, the highest virtue is gentleness, which cannot harm even those who it convicts. Um, which, by the way, I think like that entire idea sort of maybe might encapsulate some difficulties people on Twitter have been having about Christian forgiveness versus like seeking justice. Because he's like, yeah, yeah, gentleness can convict. Like you can exercise this virtue of gentleness and still like convict someone of the
Yeah,
wrongs
right.
that they have
Yeah,
done.
yeah, yeah.
But gentleness never intends to harm. And of course, for him, like the whole work is arguing against this early heresy Novatianism, which said that there were certain sins that were so vile that the church actually God and the church could not forgive those sins. And Ambrose is arguing against this. He's like, no, God's mercy is greater than his wrath, so on and so forth. But he also argues from it from like this like very simple ethical point of view that like, well, actually, like the highest, like if we know that virtue would put gentleness at at the top of the pyramid of virtues, then of course God would put gentleness at the top
Yeah.
of the pyramid of his goodness. Um, and yeah, and like this conclusion wouldn't even be alien to Kant because the that
Yeah,
virtue
yeah.
he also talks about this virtue of benevolence towards humanity, which points to a very similar end. Um, so what I like though when though Kant talks about benevolence is it's actually profoundly normal. Uh, like he's like, oh, he defines like philanthropy in this very sensible way. He defines misanthropy in this very interesting way. And then he's like, oh, and then there are people who like have no hatred towards mankind, but they sort of like they have like an intention towards mankind, but they seclude themselves away from it. And like we call this shyness, but it's actually like anthropophobia. And so like, there's all this mythology surrounding
Oh,
Kant's own strangeness, that he was like some sort of alien
yeah,
being that you know walked around, did nothing but like walk around Königsberg and sit at his desk. And like, but like he doesn't end up coming off in his philosophy as an
yeah,
alien, like maybe like another famously odd philosopher, Derek Parfit, does.
yeah. Well, even if you read, so this is, just to, talk about Kant the person, right? Coming into my first explorations of Kant, yeah, I thought, kind of like a scary sounding German autist was like what my brain was telling me. It was like, like a unpleasant person. But they did the same thing to him that they did to Charles Darwin, which is this person was like really brilliant, so they made him out to actually be a weirdo. When in reality, like he's like a pretty, well-adjusted person. So some of the most interesting sources I came across while I was doing some of the research for this episode were students' notes from when Kant was a lecturer. And, they talk about how funny he was and how when they would go up to him and they'd be stressing out about some, moral problem, he'd be like, "You're overthinking it. And this is actually worse for you than, coming
Yeah.
to a right conclusion. Like, stop getting so serious about this and whatnot."
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because it does come back to this idea that like there's this conviction at the beginning of the groundwork and the metaphysics of ethics. Like it is funny because like there are these very long, complex works of ethical theory, but that ethical theory itself can get in the way of the fact that conscience like generally tells you what to do,
mhm.
anyways.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. So to what extent, like, but then again, like that also then comes around to sounding a lot like virtue ethics. Like if
Mhm.
it isn't aligning with like sort of like what you innately know is the right thing to do, then there's probably like something wrong with your ethical reasoning. Like your ethical reasoning at some point has actually trumped uh like the normal conception of goodness.
Yeah, and it is
Um,
it is interesting, right? When you look at this as like you're saying a certain, I mean, you don't want to call it a certain flavor of virtue ethics, right? But one that has like a credible commitment to, collective organization, um, and saying who can we punish and when. Um, it's interesting to think about just from a human cognitive perspective. What kind of societies would you get out of this? I'm thinking specifically like, uh, does someone, you could say, did people from different cultures really have the same moral compass in a way? Or like if you look at like Twitter,
yeah,
someone like Ayala, like if like we had her deontological system, like what would that look like?
yeah,
And that's harder. I
yeah,
think that's
yeah.
harder.
The attempts to like show how moral reasoning seems to operate in a very alien fashion in some different cultures, and it's very easy um to become a evolutionary determinist
Mhm.
about ethics in the modern world. It's like, oh, well, actually, ethics is just sort of like what you've been evolved to do. So there are some
Yeah.
people that are evolved to be like highly cooperative, and others that are evolved to be like less cooperative, and so on and so forth. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I don't find that a particularly satisfying answer to any sort of
Hmm.
ethical question. Um, it would be surprising if there were no evolutionary origins to morality, right?
Hmm.
It would be deeply shocking that there's no input. And it would also be deeply shocking if, to me, if there were contingent aspects of things that we normally think of about as morality. And like that's a very
Yeah.
old idea. Plato actually talks about this in the Laws, where he says, well, laws are not just like in the Republic. You get this sense is like, oh, you derive all law from first principles and like just apply them onto an ideal. But like that's because in the Republic, like there's no consideration of anthropology in the
Yeah.
Republic. Like that's the state as if it were like every human being was perfect and interchangeable and the same. And the Laws is quite different. And he's very explicit. It's like, well, actually, to find the best laws for a city, you have to consider its geography and the
Hmm.
character of the
Right.
people who inhabit the city as well. So you would consider this like there's some sort of cultural determination of what good law is. So in when he's like selecting the site for Magnesia, the city of the Laws, like he decides to put it landlocked on the inside, because like the idea, well, if it's a port city, it's going to get all these like outside influences that are going to constantly change the character of the city. So therefore, the better city will be more isolated.
Hmm.
Um, which is a funny conclusion and maybe like revealing of
Yeah.
how Plato felt. I mean, like, but if I had lived through the chaos that he lived through in Athens in his lifetime, I would maybe also want a more stable
Yeah.
political climate.
Yeah.
Uh,
It is interesting just cross culturally, the kind of moral invariance. I had a paper a while back where um, I think it was Joe Henrich had this idea called like the moral parochialism hypothesis, which is like it's going to be really obvious, but this is like the extent to which people are trying to find invariant universals in human behavior. It's like when a moral violation, whatever it is, happens, people are going to rate it as more severe if it happened closer to them, if it happened more recently than a long time ago, and
yeah,
like if authorities said it's okay,
yeah,
which is just like obvious, like human
yeah,
cognition. You could just like a reinforcement learning agent would do this. But so what we found was we looked at different people in Los Angeles and asked them about specific moral violations, and then we asked people in South Korea about specific moral violations, and we asked them about the causality of what they think led to that violation. So, like in Los Angeles, people were prone to say, "Yeah, the person like kicked his friend because he was a bad person." In Korea, they were likely to say, "Oh, the conditions in his life were such that uh, he felt he had to kick someone."
yeah.
But
That's
then, but
really
but wait, listen to this part. This is the kicker.
okay.
Their likelihood to punish the offender was exactly the same. So
Yeah,
so the
this is
Koreans
this
were
is
like,
really
"Oh, we still
yeah,
have to
yeah,
punish these people." Like,
yeah. This is really funny to me though because there's so much in American elite culture of like
oh
the
yeah,
Jean Valjean theory of criminality, that
yeah.
like the only reason like the reason that someone like brings a gun to a convenience store and holds it up is because they're like in utter desperation. It's like
They like need
not because
diapers and
it's not
liquor.
because they're an impulsive asshole who just like suddenly decides they need money for drugs, so they hold up a
Yeah.
convenience store. Like what actually happens, um, and and like it's like, oh no, because like and it is it's funny. It's like it is a failure of
Mhm.
modeling other people's minds. uh it's like
Oh right,
you,
yeah.
because like you're imagining what would it take for me to go like take a gun and hold it to a convenience store clerk's head and demand all the money in the cash register. And it has to be something extraordinarily extreme happening in your life for like that to even enter your mind. And even if even if it entered your mind, you probably still wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
So therefore, the reason that that person is doing that is because something extreme is happening to them, and they're in a situation of desperation, um, which is, yeah, it's just you're failing like this, yeah, like this Turing test, basically. Like,
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, you're yeah, but it comes back to this idea about I liked what you were saying earlier about
yeah,
gentleness.
yeah,
So like in the Korean system, I mean, the Japanese system is almost the same in terms of the way that they, causally attribute moral violations, but they still have a death penalty.
yeah,
Um, like you can still use punishment in a kind of gentle way, or with, the thought
yeah,
being considered of justice as a mercy towards a person that you're punishing, when you lock
yeah,
them up instead of letting them back out on the street where they can, menace people.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, this is interesting too, because like you actually find attitudes like this about criminality more when you look at um, early modern or late medieval sources. Like if you're
hmm,
just like reading diaries or like things like that, it's like people often have like this very like almost pathetic view of criminals. It's like, oh, like these poor people, like in some sense, but then they will like still like happily go down and watch them hung on the
yeah.
at the public square. It's like it's very hard for us to enter into like that particular view of morality, where
Yeah.
there's
Yeah. I
both
mean,
like
this is
this
how this,
intense sympathy, but then like what we would consider sadism, which is like a willingness to go out and watch the punishment.
yeah. I mean, this is how Discipline and Punish opens, right?
Yeah.
Foucault lays out this whole, like, you're reading it and you're like, you could tell. Anyway, I don't want to say it, but it seems to me Foucault was getting a little excited right in that first chapter. But like, his whole point is that, like, for us, it's very shocking. But for the people on the sidelines, they thought, this
Yeah.
is what they had to do, and they had to also, be merciful towards the person as they're, extracting this punishment from them.
Yeah. So this
Which is
leads,
very
yeah,
alien, but yeah.
yeah, yeah. This leads me down. Like, I think we've come up with like some possible uh, good topics
Hmm.
for future things to talk about. One is like maybe trying to strongman virtue ethics a little bit in a future episode. I think another thing to consider is an episode on the theory of criminal justice
That would be
itself.
great. Yeah.
Um, And then another thing going back that I thought of when you were bringing up like the fact that the murderer example comes out of this exchange with Benjamin Constant. Um,
Hmm.
there's his speech in defense of the liberty of the moderns versus that of the ancients,
Mm.
uh, and that is like a work that is sort of like it's a foundational text of modern liberalism. Um, in its
By
reasoning.
Constant.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I have, yeah, I have a lot of disagreement with it. And I think that there's a lot to be said about the fact that the moral and political mindset that happened in the American Revolution is actually like pre-modern liberalism. Like we very quickly adapted the point of view that's in Constant at some point, but actually there's something alien about the founding era that we often don't appreciate. I think
Oh wow.
there's something there as well. Um, but I think yeah, we've sort of come to the end of talking about Kant and or like at the miscellany part of this now.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you'd like to say about Kant before we wrap up here?
Not really. I will add that one kind of so it seems like there's a couple of strains going on in the podcast as we've kind of advanced it. One is we keep coming back to the issue of virtue ethics.
Yeah,
Uh, so we do need to discuss that, but also in light of we did the episode on Saint Maximus the Confessor, And then I was talking earlier about the critique of judgment, which talks about teleology,
Yeah.
is also just teleology, right? So it sounds like it's
Yeah.
something we just need to, do Aristotle.
Yeah.
um,
Like I said, I think we should start with I mentioned this before. We should start with the physics.
the physics, yeah.
Because it is a strange it is a strange book that people I think often uh they come into with the wrong impression of like the type of book that they're reading and then misread it because of that.
Hmm.
Which I know there was a novel we were talking about discussing Ernst Junger's Glass Bees
Glass
as like
bees.
this prophecy of the technological panopticon.
I have it right here.
So like that's something I think we'll do shortly in the future. I think we should do that. We should do Aristotle's physics, and I think actually as an introduction to virtue ethics, because it's so short and I think it's so good, we should do Murdoch's Sovereignty of the Good. But anyways, that wraps it up for this episode of the Horizons Review. Thanks, Cody. If you're listening on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Otherwise, please subscribe on Substack so you can get alerted for the latest episodes and also the essays that go up there. And thank you. Goodbye.